Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Recovery Couch, where I'm your host, Brandon Couch, and we're going to continue our mini-series that we call Learning Together. In this series, we've discussed a myriad of topics regarding addiction and recovery. We started off with the stages of drug use, the initial stage, where somebody experiments or tries drugs or alcohol. Talked about the dependency stage and the addicted stage. Then we went into discussing the critical components for an effective treatment program and what those look like. We dove into different substances, alcohol, marijuana, and most recently we talked about narcotics. If you'd like to revisit those episodes, please do so anywhere you listen to podcasts. But today we're going to dive into the history of narcotics. This is a very informative episode that tells us where narcotics came from, how they started, and how it eventually became an opioid epidemic here in America. Buckle up, it's going to be a good episode. I can't wait to share this information with you right after a word from our sponsors. This episode of the Recovery Couch is brought to you by our incredible sponsors. A huge thank you to Greg Swartz at Remax Victory and Affiliates. If you're out there looking to buy or sell your home, Greg is the guy who will walk with you every step of the way. Contact Greg and get the process started today. Also want to shout out my good friend JB Davis over at South Dayton Toyota. JB and his team are committed to serving our community with quality vehicles and unbeatable service. If you're looking for a car, go see JB and his team at South Dayton Toyota and tell them the Recovery Couch sent you. The history of narcotics. Where'd they come from? Where was the first documented use? And what narcotic was the first documented narcotic? The use of the poppy plant for pain relief was the first documented narcotic. It was used for pain relief, sleep, medicinal, and recreational purposes, and dates back to at least 3000 BC, when ancient Egyptians cultivated what they called the joy plant. Ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabian cultures all were aware of the benefit and healing power of the plant. They were also aware of the addictive nature of its use. The actual method of extracting raw opium from the poppy plant was well known by the 1st century AD. For the next several centuries, smoking opium was widespread in both the Middle East and in the Far East. Much of the spread of opium use is credited to the Arabs, who cultivated and traded the plant because of its medicinal benefits. Opium was also used as an alternative recreational drug to alcohol, because alcohol was forbidden by the Quran. Arab traders introduced the drug as far west as North Africa and as far east as China. The drug was not immediately popular in China, however. Introduced in the 8th century, widespread use did not develop until 400 or 500 years later. Records suggest that the Chinese probably first identified the problems that opium addiction could cause. During the same time period, the drug became popular in India. The Indian government actually controlled the cultivation and sales of opium. Revenue from the sales of opium were an important source of government funds, which is interesting to me, that even in the beginning stages of narcotics, the opium became such a popular substance that it was a significant source of government funding. Medicinal and recreational use of opium was common in Europe by the 17th century. Initially, it was the physicians who praised its ability to treat a variety of ailments. Many others also used the drug recreationally, mixing opium with alcohol, known as laudanum, spelled Laudanum, where they enjoyed the euphoria and dreamlike state the two drugs would induce. A profitable trade was then established between the Orient and Great Britain around opium, which eventually resulted in the Opium War in the years of 1839 to 1842. So let's think about that for a second. Drug use was so significant, opium use, a narcotic, similar to heroin, fentanyl, Percocet, Vicodin today. The opium use was so prevalent around the years of 1830 to 1845 that there was a war, an opium war. Countries decided to go to war over a drug. When the Chinese emperors tried to outlaw the sales and use of opium in China, that's when the war began. British victory resulted in widespread and free trade in opium, which is probably part of the reason why we continue to deal with the effects of narcotics today. We feel it throughout our community, whether we use them or not. Back to the history. Until 1803, opium was the sole narcotic product available. Then, around 1803, a German pharmacist, Friedrich Sertuner, and bear with me because there's some difficult names and substances to pronounce throughout this episode, so bear with me. So in 1803, a German pharmacist, Friedrich Sertuner, isolated the principal active ingredient of opium. Because this new drug tended to create sleep in the user, he called the product morphine, named after Morpheus, the Greek god of sleep. Also, another interesting fact, and I can't help but think, and I don't know if your mind goes here too, but I wonder if that had anything to do with the character Morpheus in the Matrix movie. And I have to think it does, because the character Morpheus is the one that introduces the red pill and the blue pill to Neo. And when he introduces the red pill and the blue pill to Neo, tells him that the blue pill will keep him basically asleep to the truth that inevitably will hurt. And this is kind of in the first meeting that the two characters ever have. So my guess, and this is strictly just a guess, is that whoever created the characters of the Matrix movie had done their research on drugs and created the character Morpheus and the blue pill as basically you can stay numb to the world. You can stay asleep, like Morpheus, the Greek god of sleep. Or you can wake up with the red pill to the truth of the spiritual warfare that's going on. Back to the history. Even though the hazards of opium use were well known, the dangers of morphine use were not established for many, many years. So opium, at this point, it was well known that opium was dangerous. When the German pharmacist creates the morphine, nobody has any clue that morphine is just as dangerous, which is interesting. In 1832, a second compound, codeine, was discovered. Now, we're not going to get into the actual substances, the actual narcotics, like we did in the last episode. If you want to hear more about morphine and codeine and what they do, how they were created, that was the last episode of Learning Together. Go back, check that out. It's a great episode. But this is more about the history of narcotics. Where did they come from? How did we get from opium to fentanyl overdoses and opioid epidemic? So back to the codeine. It's less potent than morphine and was found to have great benefit as a cough suppressant. Due to a tuberculosis outbreak in the United States, codeine was widely used to prevent the spreading of that specific illness. Throughout the 19th century, opium, morphine, and codeine, the use of these three were widespread in the United States. And I'm guessing that these products got to became global because Great Britain won the Opium War. Had China won the Opium War, we may not have seen the spread of these. We may have, but we may not have also. The practice of smoking opium was introduced to the Chinese immigrants who migrated to the west coast of America. Opium dens were established for Chinese immigrants, and many American citizens, especially women, frequented the smoking dens, the opium smoking dens. All three products were also being used more commonly than most people recognized. That's an interesting choice of word that they use in this book, because I can't help but to think, is it the fact that they were being used more than people recognized, or were they being used more than people wanted to admit? During this era, a variety of over-the-counter patent medicines were being sold, claiming their ability to cure anything from bowel disorders to liver ailments, to even curing for melancholia or melancholy, I think. Opium, morphine, codeine, alcohol, and even cocaine were primary ingredients in such products as Dr. King's Discovery for Consumption, Winstar's Balsam of Wild Cherry, Mr. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and Bernie's Catarrh Cure. So, opium, morphine, codeine, alcohol, and cocaine were an over-the-counter medications at this point, cough syrups, cough suppressants. The invention of the hypodermic syringe in 1853 took the problem of narcotic addiction to new heights. I think a lot of us today correlate the white and orange hypodermic needles with IV drug use. This is telling us that these hypodermic needles were invented in 1853 and took the problem of narcotic addiction to a whole nother level. With the invention of the hypodermic syringe, the problems associated with morphine began to increase, and the addictive quality of the drug became more understood. During the Civil War, morphine was freely used in battlefield hospitals. So if a soldier gets hurt in the battlefield, say they were shot in the leg, they would go to the battlefield hospital and be treated with morphine. Intravenous morphine was an effective way of providing relief from battlefield wounds. Because morphine and codeine also had a side effect of causing constipation, both were freely used to control dysentery encountered in the crowded, unsanitary army camp. So at this point in time, army camps were probably, especially the first aid stations, were probably intense. And this is telling us that they were crowded and they were unsanitary. An addiction to morphine increased dramatically in these unsanitary camps. And morphine addiction was often referred to as the soldier's disease. So let's stop there for a minute. So as somebody who identifies as a recovering drug addict, whose addiction started with a prescription to Vicodin when I was active duty, you can't help but to stop and pause there and think, man, history continuously repeats itself. I've been in drug and alcohol rehabilitation treatment centers with veteran brothers who have suffered from this same disease of addiction. I've suffered from back in the late early 1900s. They were suffering from it. During the last half of the century, it was estimated that over 1 million individuals in the United States were addicted to narcotic drugs. The government began pressuring medical science to develop a cure for this increasing problem. In 1898, A.H. Bayer, founder of the Bayer Company in Germany, introduced a new product that he claimed to be a heroic drug which could cure addiction to opium, morphine, and codeine. Bayer had been working with a process known as diacetylation. He had used this process on salicylic acid to make the product less hazardous to the stomach, and marketed his diacetylated salicylic acid under the name of Bayer aspirin. He figured that if he could make this product less harmful to the body, then he could also make morphine less harmful in the same fashion. He marketed diacetylmorphine under the trade name of Heroin and found that indeed many morphine and opium addicts stopped using those drugs with no problem because they were now on heroin. It took medical science several years to recognize that those addicted had simply switched one type of addiction for addiction to a more potent narcotic agent. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States suffered from an unprecedented drug problem. Not only were all of the narcotic drugs legal and available over the counter, but other drugs such as cocaine, marijuana, and alcohol were unrestricted as well. It was not until passage of the Federal Food and Drug Act of 1906 that the government began to take steps to control the availability of such products. The act did not outlaw such drugs, but it did require that over-the-counter products be labeled so the consumer was aware of the ingredients they contained. So until around 1906, if you had a cough or a common cold and you were prescribed Bernie's Catarrh Cure or Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup or Winstar's Balsam of Wild Cherry, if you went to your local drugstore and picked up one of those over-the-counter medications, it could have had codeine, morphine, cocaine, alcohol, a combination of those substances in it. Till 1906, when the Federal Food and Drug Act took steps to control the availability. The federal government finally began controlling access to such drugs with the passage of the Narcotics Act of 1914. This law established a mechanism of record keeping for the importation, manufacture, distribution, sale, and prescription of narcotic drugs. It outlawed non-medical use of heroin, severely limited the amounts of opium, morphine, and cocaine use in over-the-counter products, which is interesting because it doesn't say that it eliminated. So this Narcotics Act of 1914 severely limited the amounts of opium, morphine, and cocaine used in over-the-counter products, but it did not eliminate the use of opium, morphine, and cocaine in over-the-counter products. This act, the Narcotics Act of 1914, also placed many of the drugs in the hands of medical science to prescribe it in a more responsible manner. One major problem that the act created, however, was that it required narcotic addicts to be registered, which forbade physicians from prescribing narcotics to known addicts. These policies effectively ended the medical professionals' involvement in treating drug dependence for nearly 40 years. So as we know today, I learned a lot of this from my time studying substance abuse counseling at Ohio Christian University, is that it is equally important to get medical professionals involved with the counseling of somebody who is identifying as a recovering drug addict or a recovering alcoholic, because there are symptoms that only medical professionals can diagnose, and there are symptoms that only mental health professionals can diagnose. And it's possible, and in most cases, the recovering alcoholic or addict has a dual diagnosis. So the problem that the United States ran into with the Narcotics Act of 1914 is that it eliminated the medical professionals' involvement in treating drug dependence for over 40 years. So these drug addicts were on their own. We gave them all sorts of morphine when they were hurt from the battlefield, came back, passed some acts at the Senate, Congress level, whatever. And now the medical professionals' hands are off, and these people are on their own. And as we know, especially with narcotics, when somebody's on their own, the fear of the withdrawal, the sickness, the length of the withdrawal sickness, more often than not leads the user back to the drug. So there was a modification of the act, which eventually outlawed heroin completely in 1924. So at this point, it was outlawed completely. Not even for medical use was heroin allowed, which, let's keep in mind, when the German pharmacist created morphine, it was to help people to get off of opium. When heroin was created, it was to help people get off of morphine and opium. So now government officials are seeing heroin is a huge problem. Now we got to get people off of heroin. And I can't help but think, how are they not seeing the fact that every single one of these narcotics has been a problem? We've just gave somebody crutches. Every time they were sick from opium, we gave them morphine crutches. Every time they were sick from morphine, we gave them heroin crutches. So now in 1924, the government realizes heroin's done. It's out of the picture, which in turn caused many addicts to turn to the black market to maintain their dependency. With the introduction of new synthetic narcotic drugs and the growing black market activities of drug dealers, narcotic addictions continued to be a national problem. So you're starting to see from the beginning stages of the Arabians having the opium in 3000 BC, ancient Egyptians cultivating it, ancient Greeks, Romans, and Arabian cultures partook. It spread into the Middle East and the Far East. Got as far east as China and to North Africa also. eventually into America. 1803, opium being the sole narcotic, to the point where 1853, the hypodermic syringe was introduced. People started injecting narcotics to the point where they're creating acts in America to eliminate certain narcotics, to the point where now we have drug dealers finding ways into gaining mass amounts of these narcotics and distributing them on the black market. Let's also keep in mind that they already had an opium war over opium. I guess what I'm trying to highlight here is this has been a huge deal for 5,000 years plus. And maybe you should keep that in mind the next time you want to bury someone who is addicted to narcotics. This has been a 5,000 year epidemic. I'm not saying that they get a free pass, but there's a serious history to this that we're uncovering today, right here on the recovery couch. So the black market is now one of the I don't want to say sole sources, one of the primary sources of narcotics, specifically heroin. We're in about the year 1924, 1925. During the decade of the 1960s, the treatment industry began to establish programming for treatment of drug dependence. Times caught up with the medical professionals. They started realizing, okay, we have to do something to help these people. They probably saw enough cases of drug addicted people who had no resources to get help. They introduced treatment, and the industry began to establish programming for treatment of drug dependence, with the initial focus being placed on alcohol and narcotic drugs. Unfortunately, with the growing crime rate associated with drug abuse, many efforts towards treatment and rehabilitation were ignored. Instead, both federal and state governments relied on tougher laws to control and punish narcotic abusers. So at this point, narcotics are so out of control that on the state and the federal level, they start increasing the penalty for the use of and the possession of narcotic drug, making this a criminal act when in fact it is more of an addictive behavior, which it is a criminal act. I'm not dismissing that. But they're treating the criminal behavior by correcting them with incarceration, but they're not treating the root cause of the problem. During this period, new, more exotic drugs became readily available, and heroin and other narcotics use peaked during the early 1970s and began to fall. While never disappearing completely, narcotic drug use began to lose favor, particularly due to the fear of illness related to the IV use of narcotics. I think most of us would identify that fear of withdrawal. Interdiction efforts by the federal government were also successful, and the importation of illicit narcotics fell sharply during the 1980s. As we enter the 90s and the 2000s, however, we are again seeing a rise in importation and street trafficking of heroin and other narcotics. Problem. It's always been a problem. And if we go based on the pattern of history, it's going to always be a problem. The physical effects of narcotics. So why is it always going to be a problem? What is it that, if you've never taken a Vicodin, a Percocet, heroin, fentanyl, opium, codeine, morphine, what is it about these things that people just can't quit taking them? So after a narcotic drug, a person generally becomes less active and finds it difficult to concentrate. These are the physical effects of narcotics. They generally become drowsy and may indeed fall asleep for a short period of time. Many users experience a pleasant high or euphoria. This effect is the primary reason many users continue to use and abuse narcotics over a long period of time. Many people throughout history have commented on the pleasure associated with drug use, including one author, Thomas de Quincey, who wrote the following passage about morphine, quote, "But I took it, and in an hour, oh heavens, what a revulsion, what an upheaving from its lowest depths of the inner spirit, what an apocalypse of the world within me. That my pains had vanished was now a trifle in my eyes. This negative effect was swallowed up in the immensity of those positive effects that had opened before me in the abyss of divine enjoyment, thus suddenly revealed. Here was a panacea for all human woes. Here was the secret of happiness about which philosophers had disputed, for so many ages, at once discovered. Happiness might now be bought for a penny and carried in the waistcoat pocket. Portable ecstasies might be had corked up in a pint bottle, and peace of mind could be sent down in gallons by the mail coach. End quote. I think what he's saying there is, wow, I love the way that feels, right? So I think we have a tendency to think of a panhandler when we think of somebody who's addicted to drugs, not realizing that that was just a normal loved child of somebody, a normal loved parent of somebody at the first time that they took a pill or injected a narcotic, and it felt good, and that's why they kept going back. Not everyone who uses a narcotic drug experiences such effects as described above. Some effects may be less intense with lower potency narcotics such as Talwin. Some people may not experience euphoria at all, even after using morphine or heroin. They may instead become anxious or frightened. Nausea may occur, which would block the euphoric effects, and is particularly common in novice users. Heart rate and blood pressure are not greatly affected by narcotic drugs. However, the circulatory system is slow to adjust when a person gets up from sitting or lying down. As a result, the user may become dizzy or lightheaded. Narcotics have a powerful effect on the respiratory system. With large doses, the respiratory centers of the brain are impaired and breathing simply stops. Respiratory failure is the main cause of overdose deaths. We've talked about that on this series before. By far, the greatest benefit of narcotics is their ability to control pain. Their analgesic actions is stronger and better than any other category of drug. Narcotics work to change pain sensations as well as to change the response the body has to the pain sensation. While they diminish both, their best effect is on the response the body has to pain. Many people who use narcotics for pain management report still being aware of the pain, but that it no longer bothers them. And that's more what it does to the brain, binding to the receptor sites in the specific areas of the brain than it does of actually treating where the pain is or the ailment. Common side effects of narcotic use include drowsiness, depressed respiration, nausea, vomiting, increased acid flow in the stomach, constriction of the pupils, and constipation. Tolerance generally develops rapidly with continued heavy use. The withdrawal syndrome is quite pronounced. Withdrawals are terrible, scary. If you go through them once, you never want to go through them again. Indeed, the addictive nature of the most drugs has been measured in relation to the addiction and withdrawal effect of morphine. So I guess what that's telling us is that morphine is the most difficult withdrawal, according to this content. Symptoms of withdrawal include watering eyes, nasal discharge, uncontrollable yawning, and heavy sweating. This stage is followed by an agitated sleep. Agitation continues upon awakening and is accompanied by loss of appetite, depression, dilated pupils, and tremor. Tremor meaning uncontrolled body movements, jerking, shaking. Tremors are, in often case, a prerequisite to a seizure, uncontrolled body movements. At the peak of the withdrawal, which is anywhere from 36 to 72 hours, the peak, not the entire withdrawal, the peak of the withdrawal, 36 to 72 hours after cessation of use. Symptoms include alternating chills and flushing, insomnia, continued loss of appetite, violent yawning and sneezing, goose flesh or goosebumps, I guess, vomiting, nausea, abdominal cramps, elevated heart rate and blood pressure, pains in the muscles, pains in the bone, pains in your joints, muscle spasms, and jerking motions like the tremors we talked about before. The severity of the effects declines in 5 to 7 days, and I think there are many people out there that would argue that it can last, narcotic withdrawal can last for, I've heard, up to months. For me, sometimes it felt like weeks. The effects are generally not fatal, unlike alcohol or barbiturate withdrawal, which can be fatal. Alcohol and barbiturate withdrawal can lead to death. The effects of narcotic withdrawal generally are not fatal. And a user can actually go cold turkey, although abrupt cessation of use will put them into withdrawal. However, with the availability of medications to lessen the withdrawal effect, there are ways to combat withdrawal. So let's jump into some designer narcotics. Let's end one episode on some designer narcotics. Narcotic analogs. Narcotic analogs are designer narcotics made to mimic the effects of narcotic drugs. They were initially produced to skirt existing drug laws, but a change in federal drug laws in 1986, I think this is when America started really cracking down on the drug epidemic. The federal drug laws in 1986 made all analogs of controlled substances Scheduled I drugs under the Controlled Substances Act. Today, these designer drugs are sold on the streets as more powerful substances than their illicit counterparts. They are sold under the names China White, Persian White, Mexican Brown, and New Heroin. There's two primary narcotic analogs: fentanyl analogs, which is 3-methylfentanyl, parafluorofentanyl, and meperidine analogs that include MPP, 1-methyl-4-propionoxypiperidine, and PPAP, PEPAP, which is 1-2-phenylethyl minus 4-acetyloxypiperidine. I don't think that really any of that, aside from the fact that fentanyl was introduced as a narcotic analog. I think that's really the only thing that applies to us there. And that was AMF, alpha methylfentanyl AMF. AMF was probably the first substance to be called a designer drug. It is an analog of the drug fentanyl, a highly potent narcotic analgesic sold under the trade name of Sublimase. It is an extremely potent compound which has little difference between the dose that produces euphoria and the dose that proves fatal. AMF has been responsible for a great many deaths due to overdose. The effects of AMF are fast-acting but short-lasting. With a typical dose, the use generally will experience the following effects: euphoria, mental confusion, a feeling of warmth, dry mouth, dizziness, drowsiness, constriction of the pupils, constipation, and nausea. Low doses can also cause rigidity of the muscles, especially those that assist with breathing. As a result, many users suffer from breathing difficulties, including respiratory failure. An additional problem has been found with the neurological processes. AMF appears to attack the basal ganglia area in the brain, resulting in Parkinson's-like syndrome even after limited use. As a result, many users suffer from drooling, muscular rigidity, which includes a mask-like face, and a shuffling walk. Such damage can be permanent and requires the use of medications to control the effects. So we're talking about serious side effects, possibly even permanent side effects, now that we're getting into the fentanyl and the narcotic analogs. So that's fentanyl, that's AMF. There's also MPPP, these are letters, and PEPAP. MPPP first appeared on the streets in the late 1970s. It's a potent analog of the drug meperidine, Demerol, also known as Demerol. The effects of MPPP, as well as its cousin PEPAP, are not still fully known, but presumed to be comparable, though more potent than meperidine, than Demerol. These effects include euphoria, disorientation, and mild mental confusion, dizziness, drowsiness, visual disturbances, and slight respiratory depression, and these effects may last up to 3 hours. Higher doses result in sleep, inability to concentrate, increased respiratory depression, dilation of the pupils, muscle twitches, and tremors. Probably the greatest danger associated with MPPP is the frequent presence of a compound known as 1-methyl-4-phenyl 1,2,3,6-tetrahydropyridine, MPTP, which is a toxic byproduct created when excessive heat or acid is used to make MPPP. Studies reveal that MPTP has no narcotic properties, but instead is metabolized by the brain into a toxic that destroys nerve cells. The result is, again, Parkinson's-like we described with AMF or fentanyl. PEPAP has been found to have a similar byproduct known as PEPTP. It produces another neurodegenerative disease similar to Huntington's chorea. This illness causes spasmodic or spasmatic movements of the limbs and facial muscles, as well as progressive deterioration of brain tissue, with the resulting loss of mental functioning. Again, these effects are not reversible. So tough subject matter today. I know so many people who have been affected by some of these drugs that we talked about, whether they personally used them and have battled the addictive properties and the recovery stages, or they've loved somebody who's been addicted to these substances and had to watch them battle through addiction and recovery. Crazy to me how far back not just the substance goes, but the want and the need and the eventual, I hate to say it, love for the effects of the substance goes. I know this is not easy content, but it's relevant content in order for us to become aware of the history of these epidemics, of the narcotic crisis, because that's what it is. That's why these laws and these acts were put into place.